Wilbert Robinson, the old Orioles catcher, Uncle Robbie, managed the Brooklyn Dodgers from 1914 through 1931. He was so identified with the team, and teams were so disinterested in branding at that time, that the Dodgers became the Robins during his run with the team. They were the Dodgers before, they were the Dodgers after, but the fans and the newspapers, it just somehow happened that they were, short for Robinson, the Robins. Neither the uniforms nor the team stationery changed. The team was just Brooklyn, or the Brooklyn Baseball Club, and as far as they were concerned, everyone else was just on their own recognizance. I think it does say something, though, about players or managers like Robbie or Nap Lajoie, that their teams became named after them. The Cleveland Naps reflected the fact that Lajoie was the team's best player and its manager for a while. Robbie and Robbins we've already gone into, but somehow if Ty Cobb or Rogers Hornsby took over a team, they didn't become the Detroit Cobbies or the St. Louis Rajas. Truth in labeling really would have required them to be the Detroit Anger Management Problems or the St. Louis Antisocial Tendencies. No, I think for that sort of thing to stick, and you see it occasionally with other figures, such as the A's being informally called the Mac Men, though that never replaced A's or athletics, the way that Robbins for a while just totally displaced the Dodgers. It has to be kind of an affectionate tribute, and affection has to be earned. Hitting .400 a bunch of times, which if you squish Rogers Hornsby and Ty Cobb together, they did on multiple occasions, that'll earn you respect, but it won't necessarily earn you love. As I've described on the show many, many times, Uncle Robbie was a good baseball man and arguably a great pitching coach, but his long managerial career is harder to assess because whereas his Dodgers won 2 pennants and were close on literally a couple of other occasions, the team was so broke that while it was functionally owned by the banks, the phones had been turned off for non-payment. He couldn't use his office because one of those bankrupt partners would gatekeep it and yell at him whenever he tried to come in. And so as he got into his 60s, he just stopped caring that much. He wasn't an intense guy to begin with. He and John McGraw, who was his best friend for a long time, until they had a falling out, that falling out leading to Uncle Robbie defecting to the Dodgers. They were kind of an odd couple, opposites attract pair, with Robbie supplying the good humor, the humanity, whereas McGraw was always ready to be an arsonist of his life, or at least of the game that he was managing. And although Robbie could also be critical, he could scold, he didn't have anything like McGraw's level of vindictiveness in him. He was a life is for living, joie de vivre kind of guy. So while he loved baseball, he wasn't going to destroy himself over it. There was always more hunting and fishing to do. Judging by his physique, he really liked to eat what he caught as well, most likely fried in a lot of butter. The more butter, the better. To put it simply, he was obese. And I'm not fat-shaming Uncle Robbie. Certainly let him who is without avoirdupois throw the first blob of suet. I'm just pointing out a natural consequence of his enthusiasms, and something that if you have ever seen a photo of him, or if after this episode you choose to look some up, you will notice it right off the bat. He did not have the healthiest lifestyle. Somewhere in my files here, I have a copy of a picture of Uncle Robbie on a stationary bicycle, and that copy came without any context whatsoever. No caption at all. So I don't know what inspired it, or who placed him on that bicycle, or if they needed a hoist, the way that knights in armor used to be winched onto the back of their destriers. All I can tell you is there Robbie is on the 1920s or early 30s equivalent of a Peloton, looking directly at camera and seemingly a little winded, a little desperate to get up. Can I stop now? Please? We've all been there. Well, let me correct that. I've been there. I don't want to speak for you. Allow me only to add that as the least athletically instinctive person that you will meet, someone who has too much executive authority to have anything like reflexes, that it would have been very helpful to me to have encountered gym teachers who taught, but I never had that. Going back to elementary school, I had gym shamers, I had occasionally, though I didn't know it at the time, and I'm not joking about this when I say there were gym touching children inappropriately people, but there never was a teacher. Not a one of them ever said, no, this is how you do it. Maybe no one's ever demonstrated that for you before. If I might digress for one more second, I have a fond memory of about 7th grade in which we were told, we kids, to go out and run a certain course, which included some hilly areas. And the gym teacher who told us to do that was in roughly Uncle Robbie shape himself. And a female classmate of mine said, I have asthma. I'm not doing that. It's not safe for me. And he responded with words approximating, you'll do it, sister, and like it. And she looked at his physique with a kind of gimlet eye and said, I'll do it if you can do it. And you know what? He didn't and she didn't. But something perhaps more interesting about Uncle Robbie's appearance. Every picture of him, even his pencil portrait on the cover of Time magazine in 1930, shows this very large scar expanding from the left corner of his mouth to about halfway across his cheek. Casey Stengel, who played for Robbie, had a similar scar. Now, Casey always readily admitted how he was disfigured. He got into a fight with a Dodgers teammate, pitcher Whitey Appleton, and Appleton, as part of that scrap, just hooked his fingers into Casey's mouth and tore it open. Not pleasant to contemplate, but there it is. It's in every picture of the old man. Well, I take that back. When Casey appeared in newspapers or magazines, now and again, some editor would take it upon themselves to kind of clean him up a little bit, airbrush that scar out. But it's there about 95% of the time. And the same thing is true of Uncle Robbie. The difference, besides the path that the scar takes away from their respective pie holes, it's not very poetic, is it? The difference is that Uncle Robbie would never admit where he got the scar. I have yet to see a source which explains it. You'd think it would have been a kind of big deal. It's very noticeable. It's like the canals of Mars. Ray Bradbury might have written 3 different short stories about it. That's how obvious it is. And I don't know what the 1880s, 1890s version of an ER was, but you'd think Uncle Robbie would have had to go. Your face is pretty vascular, don't you know? And you'd think he would have lost a lot of blood and required all the stitches they had on the premises. Well, in that Time magazine story, they do make reference to it. It's not very much of a story at all, actually, but it's pretty cool that Uncle Robbie had a Time magazine cover story once upon a time when that sort of thing meant something. Here's how that story describes him. Round, loquacious, genial, with big muscles, a fine anecdotal memory, a hearty appetite, and a short, deep scar in his cheek. Manager Robinson, 66, has worked at baseball every summer for 50 years. End quote. Nothing special, right? Nothing I haven't already told you over the last 7.5 minutes or so. But there's an asterisk after the word scar, and at the bottom of the page it says, whence this scar, he will not tell, except to say he did not get it playing baseball. Now, Robbie was a trained butcher. Did he have an accident with a knife? Did Ty Cobb accidentally or intentionally shoot him while they were hunting out of Robinson's famous Dover Hall hunting lodge in Georgia? Was he just mugged? He and McGraw owned a saloon in Baltimore for a while. Did he intervene in the wrong drunken brawl, have a broken bottle slash across his face? As Robbie played during the most cutthroat period of baseball, those 1880s and 1890s, I've always figured that an opposing player simply spiked his face on a play at the plate. But if it wasn't baseball, I'm afraid it will remain a mystery forever, as Robbie has been gone a long time and is beyond asking. Not that he would tell us. If he didn't tell Time, why would he tell us? Maybe one day the stalks of corn at the Field of Dreams will part, and instead of Shoeless Joe and the gang, I mean, why should they hang around there now? They've been pardoned by Rob Manfred. Maybe then it will reveal the many Negro Leaguers who were prevented from playing in the bigs, which is what a fantasy of that nature always should have depicted. But putting that aside, maybe Uncle Robbie will come out too, and we can kind of corner him and get him to fess up. Possibly by tickling him. He looks like the sort of fella who would have been vulnerable to a good tickling. So Robbie knew baseball, and he knew meat, and he knew hunting. Possibly he even knew how to ride a bike, but he didn't know spelling. And there's a story about him that appears almost everywhere someone wrote more than 2 consecutive words about him. I've even mentioned it here before. It concerns the bench player Oscar Rutger, who was briefly with the Dodgers in 1927. I really wish we had not just Uncle Robbie around, but Charles Schultz as well, because Rutger was with the St. Paul Saints of the American Association for all or part of 8 seasons, and Sparky Schultz, who was a kid back then, followed that team closely enough that he later mentioned their second baseman, Ali Bima, in a couple of peanut strips with a lot of affection to them. The Rutger story has a number of variants, but the basics of it are that the Dodgers, who were a lot like this year's Pirates, in that they had some very good pitchers, but pretty much no hitting at all. Although, contra these Pirates, they were very old, not young like Paul Skeens. And since they did not have very much money for scouting at the time, one of the things that they did fairly well with, actually, these teams never bottomed out, by which I mean that although there were a number of them that finished under 500, they were generally decent. They weren't this year's Rockies or last year's White Sox or even just your typical 100 game losers. They never did. And that was because they were solid enough at finding those older pitchers I mentioned who Robbie could rehabilitate, and these minor league vets like Rutger who they would give a shot to, and they would piece together a lineup that, while hardly dominant, and in the case of the version of the team that we're talking about, really bad actually, but still they were able to kind of hold their own. No one was very impressed at the time, and certainly the fans resented it and or mocked them, but it's kind of neat that the Dodgers did it year after year. And yet, though, no one gives out awards for treading water when you think about how bad teams are at just staying on the tightrope. The Uncle Robbie Dodgers were remarkable. For 18 years, his winning percentage was .506, and his teams ranged from the 1916 club, which went 94-60, which is a .610 winning percentage, to the team we're talking about, the 1927 club, which went 65-88, which is .425. He never lost 90 games, whereas he won 90 3 times. So they signed Rutger as part of this sort of flea market secondhand approach to team building, but it turned out that they didn't really have a place for him. They had picked him up during the winter between the 1926 and 27 seasons after he had hit .335 with 19 home runs in 124 games, again for the St. Paul Saints. And even though he would have seemed to have had some upside, I think the problem was that he was not a center fielder. He was more of a first base, right field sort of fellow, and the Dodgers initially had all of those positions blocked up. 2 of their better players, Max Carey, a future Hall of Famer, and a utility guy named Harvey Hendrick, yet one who could kind of hit. They started out the season playing in the corners. During the season, Hendrick temporarily moved to first base, which would have opened up left field. But a journeyman named Gus Felix chose that moment to get crazy hot, hit .350 for about a month or 6 weeks, and by the time it became clear that that was a fluke, and he coasted down to under 300, well, you know how managers are with lightning in a bottle. They often keep playing that hand, hoping that the Firefly will come back to life. But in fact, no, the Firefly has no Lazarus act in him at all, and you can't get it back. But Rutger was not going to break into the lineup as long as there was the chance that Gus Felix would wake up again. The thing is that Uncle Robbie was supposed to be funny, and that's not a funny story. It's just a baseball story. And so they told a story about Robbie and Rutger that was better, but it has a lie in it, and that's how we know it's fake. Most versions of the story go like this. Once upon a time, Wilbert Robinson decided to give Oscar Rutger a start. So he takes out a pencil and begins filling in his lineup card. Carey, right field. Stats, center field. Herman, first base. And the next, him. Yeah, let us begin. No, that's not right. R-E-O-Q. No, R-I-T-T-U-H-G-A-R. Damn it. Oh well, Dick Cox, left field. Now that story is a lie because Dick Cox wasn't with the Dodgers at all in 1927, not even in spring training. He's an interesting story himself. A 29-year-old rookie in 1925, he hit very well that year. Less well in 1926, a kind of dietary 296. It sounds like I'm obsessed with dieting today. It's not true. Trust me, I'm going out for pancakes in about 12 hours. And even though the Dodgers surely appreciated Dick Cox for having one of the more pornographic names in baseball history, they still dumped him off to Los Angeles of the Pacific Coast League. Again, this would seem kind of hard to understand because they didn't have a great many players better than old Dick Cox, but as Tommy Holmes of the Brooklyn Eagle explained at the time, Cox's failure is a conundrum. There's a great natural hitter, a good ball player, who simply refuses to take himself seriously. A natural comedian, perfectly harmless as far as others are concerned, Dick positively declined to settle down, play ball, and make the most of a shining opportunity to succeed in the big league. Everybody knows and admitted that Cox can play ball, and everybody connected with the club knew and will admit that Dick never did the team a darned bit of good. Maybe he'll come back a wiser, saner gent. Everybody hopes so. Well, it never did happen. So, in short, Uncle Robbie did not play Oscar Rutger because he couldn't spell his name, but because he didn't want to play him. Besides, what umpire was going to penalize the Dodgers, say that Rutger batted out of order because Uncle Robbie spelled his name Rotgut on a lineup card? Are we really meant to believe that Robbie was the only illiterate or at the very least spelling-challenged manager in the history of baseball? They weren't all lawyers like Miller Huggins. And yet recently, I found another kind of parallel version of this story, not with Oscar Rutger, but with a different player. It doesn't make any more sense than the original does, but let's go with it for a second. It was in one of Donald Honig's books. In April 1929, the Robins traded for catcher Val Picinich. It was really a swap of backup catchers with a fringe pitcher and Brooklyn backstop Johnny Gooch headed to Cincinnati in return for Picinich. He was very much your standard backup catcher, a career .258, .334, .361 hitter. So better than some glove-only receivers, worse than you would probably want in a starter. His big claim to fame was that he had a 5-year residency in Washington, D.C. as Walter Johnson's personal catcher. That was during the years 1918 to 1922. With the Dodgers in his first year, he alternated with Hank DeBerry, who was Dazzy Vance's personal backstop. He played about as much or even more as you would have expected him to, 93 games. Nevertheless, according to Honig, Picinich complained to Uncle Robbie that he wasn't getting enough playing time. "I don't know how to spell your name," Robbie replied. "Why don't you let somebody else make out the lineup card?" Picinich suggested. "That's a good idea," Robbie said. Thus concluded the first and last cabinet meeting to be held by the 999th administration to rule over the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show. You know, as I've gone back through some of the older episodes for the reissue series, I've just been astounded at how badly, how warped, how warbly some of those early well, hello there's are. I don't know why I started doing that. I just began initially by saying, well, hello there. It just seemed like a natural thing to say. It wasn't like I sat around and workshopped different introductions to the program. I just started doing it. Who is doing it? Why is he doing it? Well, I am Stephen Goldman, your convivial host of the Infinite Inning Podcast, number 333, yet another journey to the past in pursuit of a better understanding of the present, the time machine, as always, or as is often the case, the game of baseball. And yes, today, for reasons I'm not quite sure of, I just happen to have Brooklyn Dodgers on my mind. Although, to just give you a little insight into how I think about things, I had initially planned to talk about the role that the Brooklyn Dodgers indirectly played in the United States, or the Allies, I should say, because the British were there too, winning the very deadly 1944 Battle of the Bulge during World War II. And somehow I got sidetracked into this other stuff, whether it's Oscar Rutger or, as we're going to talk about in the second half of the show, Dolph Camilli and Pee Wee Reese. And I hope you do enjoy both of today's conversations, both of which are themed to, as the title of the episode suggests, leadership. Very briefly, our usual bulletin board section, the most recent reissue episode of the show, went back to episode 44, and in a coincidence that I might have undone had I realized that things were going to work out with this episode's stories, also went back to a couple of Brooklyn Dodgers tales, including one of my favorites from the early run of the show, and that is the story of Cookie Lavagetto and his biggest fan. As always, I spoke for a few minutes beforehand trying to supply some new or enlarged context for those stories, and for those who don't listen to the reissue episodes, I found myself wondering if there's a word for a kind of affection that is not unreciprocated or unrequited, but it's not reciprocated or requited equally. Or is that a meaningless distinction? Because if person A loves person B at a level sufficient to want to be in some sort of intimate partnered relationship with them, whereas person B does return some of those feelings, but doesn't want to be in that intimate partnered relationship, isn't that equivalent to a rejection regardless? I guess this is what people mean by being friend-zoned nowadays. It's not a term that was in use when I was in my youth and still a courtin'. We may not have had a word for it, but it absolutely happened to me, and I no doubt did it to some other people as well. And it sounds cruel, but perhaps without really thinking about it. And I admit, maybe I shouldn't admit to this, but I was confused by it, which is not to say that another person doesn't have the right to not want to be with you in whatever sense. They absolutely do. But I know that when I was a teenager, it was confusing to me when, say, I met a girl and we would hang out and we would have conversations and we would talk hours on the phone and we would laugh together or do things together and spend wonderful, rewarding time together. And then she would go off and date somebody else. And of course, as I got older, I learned to understand this better, but it was hard at the time to accept that you can have someone in your life, particularly of the gender that you are interested in, and who is interested in your gender in the same sense, who will prioritize you, who will come to you to cry on your shoulder when they are feeling down, or to smile when they want to laugh. But when it comes to kissing, that's somebody else's department. And you say to yourself, well, where am I falling short with this? What am I doing wrong? And I still don't know if I really get the answer to that. And it may be as simple as the fact that whether we're talking about teenagers or adults, that the heart wants what it wants and doesn't want what it doesn't want, even though it wants 98% of the package. But that's kind of the gap that I'm talking about here. The only thing I do know for certain is that once one party in that equation has, as the kids say, caught feelings, and the party of the first part has not, then, well, the party of the second part is doomed. Yes, you were having a good time together, but from now on, that's over unless you can cope with reeling things back. Your feelings, I mean. And that is very, very difficult. You might consider transferring to another planet, I mean. Over at Baseball Prospectus, this week's You Can Look It Up column spoke about Casey Stengel and a now obscure, at least to most of us, paleontologist named Fielding Meek, who lived with bones beneath the stairs of the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. The piece is about rejection, loneliness, and, would you believe, an expansive view of what the government can do for us. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what it did for Fielding Meek. On that note, we are terribly overdue for a break, so let's take one. And after this brief intermission, we will return to the Brooklyn Dodgers to talk about an instance of trying to damage someone else's reputation to sustain your own, one of the most selfish things a person can do. I know you'd never do that, and I'll prove it on the other side. I look forward to seeing you there. A couple of days ago, I was surveying some other podcasts in the field, not necessarily the competition, but just kind of getting the lay of the land. And the most popular in one particular genre that I was looking at averages 3 hours in length. If that's the kind of podcast you want, brother, you can have it. Because to me, that's talking about relationships. That's a commitment. That's not even a conversation or a lecture. It's a harangue. What was interesting, though, was that the next 20 down were all 30 minutes long, 25 minutes long. And I thought, gee, we always hang out here for 45 minutes to an hour. Maybe I'm overdoing it. So noting that, perhaps with no further ado, we should begin the next act of the program. When we blame the messenger isn't the only one who suffers harm. I suppose the 1930s and 1940s first baseman Dolph Camilli isn't terribly well remembered today, even though he was the 1941 National League Most Valuable Player when he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, he was just a very good player, not a Hall of Famer. He had a bit of a late start in the majors due to spending 5 years in the Pacific Coast League, a stay perhaps prolonged by a badly broken leg early on. I wonder if that, too, was a reflection of the fact that he was from California, and that he had a large family, and maybe he didn't want to uproot them. I'm not sure about that. What I do know is that as a result of that late start in the majors, he did not play regularly until he was 27 and didn't become a star until he was 29. He made a couple of all-star teams after that. His peak lasted only 7 years, from 1936 to 1942, and in that time, he was a .288, .409, .532 hitter, averaging 27 home runs a season. It sounds a bit like, shall we say, peak Mark Teixeira, but in context, Camilli was 10% better. Once that period was over, he was 36. Age started to catch up with him, baseball age, I should say. He was still playable, especially with the World War II manpower shortage, but there was a touch of Joe DiMaggio in him. Maybe that was something inherent in being a Bay Area Italian at the beginning of the 20th century, that ethic, and he just wouldn't play if it meant the fans would get less than his best. His teammate, the pitcher Freddie Fitzsimmons, later said, "Camilli was one of the most conscientious players I ever saw. He actually worried himself into physical sickness when he wasn't hitting. He'd take long walks at night alone worrying. He felt he was a drag on the team." Now, that isn't necessarily a healthy way to live, but there is a wonderful respect for the fans and for yourself in setting that sort of standard for yourself, not to mention an honesty in how you perceive what you are accomplishing. The danger, of course, is being so self-critical that you have a distorted view, but I don't sense that that was the case with Camilli. He had come up with the Cubs in 1933, did not set the world on fire. A year and a half later, the Cubs made one of the low-key worst trades in their history. We've talked about this before. They sent Camilli to the Phillies straight up for fellow first sacker Don Hurst. My tongue wanted to trip, and I almost said, Don Hurts. Well, he did. He hurt a lot. He was a career .303, .382, .488 hitter with the Phillies. But the Baker Bowl was a very silly park, about the size of a walk-in closet, and not like Imelda Marcos's walk-in closet, but something much more lower middle class. Hurst, and again, stop me if you've heard this before, was a career .276, .350, .438 hitter away from Philadelphia, and in the hitting happy, hippie-hoppy early 1930s, that was really not such a big deal, even if you were, say, a middle infielder and not a first baseman. At the Bowl, he hit .332, .414, .540. Guess which version of him the Cubs got? Trick question! They got neither. Hurst hit .199 in 51 games in Cubs drag, and that was it for his major league career. Now, Hurst and Camilli had this much in common. They were dealt because they had the nerve to hold out for better salaries. This was, of course, their right and their obligation, and I will even say, as I often do of players with huge park disparities, that not everyone went into the Baker Bowl and slugged .540 there. Now, that's a weaker argument with that park in particular than I could make about, say, Fenway Park. Not every player goes into Fenway Park and turns into Jim Rice just because they're a right-handed hitter facing the Green Monster. The Baker Bowl had more equanimity than that. It was so small that everyone benefited. Still, Hearst had something of a point, and I will say that to this day, he retains by a fraction of a point the second highest batting average by a Phillies first baseman in modern team history. I will tell you who had the highest in modern team history in probably less than a minute and a half. I'm just guessing, so don't go to whatever online casino takes prop bets about podcasts, because I'm not positive. I haven't held a stopwatch on this. And besides, that kind of gambling ain't healthy for you on any level. Hearst and Camilli did have bad timing in the sense that the Great Depression was on, teams were feeling the pinch, and the Phillies felt the pinch more than most because they were so badly mismanaged, and they were the second team in a two-team town. But Camilli had 7 kids, so you do what you have to do to feed your family. And once he got to Philadelphia, he picked up where Hearst left out with the holdups. Wait, seriously, I'm not just quoting Willy Wonka. Switch that, reverse it. Not left out in holdups, but left off and holdouts. The Phillies owners did not appreciate that sort of thing, which worked out well for him because it got him sent away. I've talked about Jerry Nugent and his wife, the former May Mallon, so many times on this program that I'm not going to do it again now, except to remind you that they just had no business owning a major league team, particularly one in a small park in which they had another major league team competing with them, and this is not their fault, but during the worst economic slowdown in history. And the reason was that May Mallon had been left the Phillies, but not the money to run the Phillies. It's an interesting thought experiment, actually. Ask yourself, what if someone just gifted you the Yankees or the Dodgers right now, but took every penny that those teams had in the bank with them? Now, in this case, the Phillies had no money in the bank anyway. It would be sort of similar to inheriting a huge mansion, something with like 20 bedrooms and 18 bathrooms and 50 acres of manicured grounds and so forth. And you have to pay, obviously, the heating, the air conditioning, the property taxes, and the staff to keep that place up, or it's just going to fall down around your ears. That was the Philadelphia Phillies, as owned by the Nugents, and indeed the club did fall down around their ears. A very similar thing happened to Bob Quinn, when he owned the Red Sox, or co-owned them, and his main backer died. His backer's widow said, "I want to sell out." This was just a few years before the situation with the Phillies we're talking about, and Bob, being cash poor, faced a decision. He could either sell the whole team, or he could go deep into debt to buy out the widow and keep the team himself. And ultimately, he chose to keep it, which I think a lot of us would do, because how many of us would get to the point of owning a Major League Baseball team, living the dream, and then voluntarily giving it up because one of our partners had the bad taste to sicken and die? It's not like you did anything wrong. You're just mere minutes away from making the trade that's going to turn this whole thing around. You know you are. It would be like spending a lot of money to get to be secret president of the United States, except no one really likes the kind of secret presidenting that you're doing. So you have 3 choices. You can give up all that power that your money bought. You can just keep doing it and try to stand the gaff. Or you can just lie to everybody and say you're not doing it. Not anymore. You're going home. But really, you keep doing it just sotto voce, at least compared to the volume at which you were broadcasting your so-called accomplishments before. I'm just making this up. It's purely hypothetical. Well, as I said, Bob borrowed money to buy out the widow Palmer, that was her name, but didn't borrow enough to run the team afterwards. And thus did we eventually get 40 years of Tom Yawkey. Oddly enough, the longest-lasting owner of the Phillies, once the National League forced the Nugents out, also refused to integrate for forever. Different story. It took the National League years to get around to the point of realizing that Jerry and May were not going to turn the Phillies around and got them to sell the team. Do you remember how long it felt like it took when the National League decided that Frank McCourt shouldn't have any more chances to destroy the Dodgers? It seemed to last about 1,000 years. Well, the Nugent defenestration felt that way too. That was still a few years away when the Nugents and Camilli had their final face-off. In 1937, now with the Phillies, Camilli had hit .339 with a .446 on base percentage and a .587 slugging percentage in 131 games. This remains the highest batting average by a Phillies full-time first baseman in the modern history of the team. See, I told you I'd let you know. Pete Rose didn't quite get there, nor John Kruk, nor Ed Delahanty, and some of that was their various eras. Pete Rose's .331 in a .261 league, second best mark on the circuit, is more impressive, I think, than Camilli's .339 in a .272 league, sixth best on the circuit, especially when you add in the park effects. Unlike Don Hurst, though, Camilli was a very good hitter away from Philadelphia. That doesn't mean the park didn't amplify him. It did. It just means that he held his own everywhere else as well. Now, if you look at his season, you might notice that whereas he scored 101 runs, he drove in only 90. That's partially because the Phillies didn't have very much of a lineup except for him, and the only way he could have really generated a lot of RBIs is if he had found a way to bat behind himself. But it was also due to the fact that he missed the first 3 weeks of the season because of his annual holdout. The season began on April 19th, he signed on April 30th, and it took 2 more weeks for him to get back on the major league field. Now you're thinking, well, of course it did. He had to work his way into shape. But it wasn't only that. He was driving cross country from California and his car broke down in Nebraska. How many times have we seen that movie? Some variant of it. The hero's car breaks down near some small town and the one mechanic in 1,000 miles says, well, I'm afraid you're going to need a new Framistat, but we'll have to have one shipped here from Malloryville. Probably take a week. A week? But I have places to be. And then either it's a fish-out-of-water comedy or a noir in which everyone in this small town turns out to be some kind of corrupt, perverted monster. There must be at least a good dozen films that springboard from that premise. But how many of them have a gratuitous nude scene and a young Woody Harrelson? Only Doc Hollywood. I am, of course, open to corrections. Maybe there's a good one that I missed. So Dolph came in, he had that great season, and then he held out again. And he should have. We all should hold out for the best deal that our skills can command, if we have skills. I mean, I don't, but you're a star. Naturally, Camilli's 1938 holdout annoyed the Phillies as much or more as his 1937 holdout had. We are tired of his yearly holdout tactics, his bickering, his discontent, and his demoralizing influence on spring training activities, Jerry Nugent said. We want no more of him and are willing to pass him off to the highest bidder if there are any bidders. He's in such a lather you half expect him to refer to the proud man's contumely or something of that nature. And of course there were bidders. The Dodgers were already on record as sniffing around, and he knew that. It was simply that he didn't want to pay and probably could not pay, but he needed to cover that. And so he was deploying fog, smoke, chaff to disguise the fact that the Phillies were about to, again, auction away one of their best players. See, a man may lack concrete accomplishments, but he can talk all day long, or at least for so long as his wind holds out. And that's what Jerry Nugent was doing at that moment. And he was doing it kicking a player who, as you've already heard, had a work ethic that impressed his teammates and fans. The Phillies should have been impressed by his worth as well, or I should say, both his work ethic and his worth ethic. Because yes, pride goeth before a fall. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. Pride can blind you to your faults, flaws, and failings. But if your pride is earned, then you carry yourself with an earned dignity and are an example to all of those around you. There was a major movie in 1973 called Save the Tiger, about a garment manufacturer who is having both a business and a midlife crisis. Jack Lemmon won the Best Actor Oscar for playing the main character, and his co-star, the always adorable Jack Gilford, was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, though he lost out to John Houseman in The Paper Chase. I saw it once a long time ago, and I found it kind of stressful, but the reason that I bring it up is that Lemon's character, as part of his retreat from the pressures of his adult life, keeps going back to his youth, to watching the Brooklyn Dodgers, and towards the end, trying to keep his sanity. He has this reverie where he seems to be praying to the Father, the Son, and now batting number 4, first baseman Dolph Camilli, number 4. It was like that when people saw the way he comported himself. And on the other side, I'll give you an example of one of the times that he provided a service to the Dodgers in calming a very nervous rookie who, unlike him, would eventually go to the Hall of Fame. So, as I hinted before the break, one of my favorite stories about Dolph Camilli is about his going out of his way to help put a young Pee Wee Reese at ease. Reese, a shortstop, was a 21-year-old rookie in 1940. Now, his bat came more or less fully formed, but he needed a little time to become a great fielder. He had the skills, but he just needed to calm down and harness them a little bit. He had a shortstop's arm, a good one, but he tended, when young, to rush his throws, and as you know, the combination of hard and errant is less valuable than soft and accurate. Compare and contrast with, say, the late Tony Fernandez, who used to throw these sidearm loopers to first base, but they always got there in time. Now, even though Reese first came up in 1940, I believe this story might not have happened until 1941, because he wasn't too error-prone the first time through. But in 1941, he did end up leading the National League in errors with 47, and it became controversial within the team. The general manager, Larry MacPhail, wanted manager Leo Durocher to bench Pee Wee in favor of Leo himself, and Leo resisted that because he knew how good Pee Wee was or could be and how bad Leo was, by which I mean that at one time he was a very good defensive shortstop, and his whole career was based on that. It surely wasn't based on hitting, but he was 35 and he felt it. This became a daily power struggle between Leo and Larry, which was bad because due to their personalities, they already argued almost every single day. As the New Yorker put it in a lengthy 1941 profile of Larry MacPhail, around 11 o'clock, Durocher comes in for a chat with MacPhail. The manager's approach is audible when he is still some distance down the hall. He usually gets involved in an argument over Dodger management with the elevator operator. He continues this with anybody who happens to be walking his way, and then with the Dodger office staff. After standing 10 minutes or so in an outer office, loudly explaining his decisions in the previous day's game to the office boys, he proceeds into MacPhail's office. If the Dodgers have lost the previous day's game, MacPhail and Durocher take up a stand facing each other with their noses about 3 inches apart and argue. MacPhail yells about what he would have done, and Durocher tries to howl him down. Parenthetically, this passage from the same New Yorker profile is one of my favorites in the entire literature of baseball and may give you an additional sense of what those arguments must have been like. MacPhail's voice is one of the most important parts of his equipment. Raspy and carrying, it has been compared, with scientific accuracy, to the call of an adult male moose. On a wall of his office is the stuffed head of a giant elk. Listening to MacPhail talk when he is standing under the specimen gives many people an eerie sensation. What caused Larry to start beating the drum for Pee Wee to be benched was that, as often happens with young players, Reese went into a fielding slump, or maybe he just got nervous and lost confidence. As I already said, Reese made his share of errors through roughly the first 2/3 of the season, 25 in 95 games, but that wasn't an especially alarming number in 1941, especially considering his range. But then he made 14 errors in August alone, and MacPhail started getting nervous because the club was in a close race with the Cardinals. 4 times that month, Reese made 2 errors in one game. MacPhail would then insist that Durocher put himself into the lineup, saying things like, "I'm paying you to see some of that sparkling infield play I've been hearing about in the papers. You don't think I'm paying you just to manage, do you? With the players I've dug up for you, I could manage this club myself and do a damn sight better job than you have." And then Durocher would tell him to get stuffed, and Larry would fire Leo, and around we go again. Leo got fired by Larry most days to hear Leo tell it. Now, the Dodgers went 3-1 in those 2 error games, but the 4th, the loss, that one was all on Pee Wee. It was August 26th, and it was, of course, it had to be against the Cardinals. Going into that day's doubleheader, the Dodgers led the Cards by just a single game in the loss column. Reese did make an error in the first game, but the Dodgers were way ahead at the time. The runner didn't score. No harm. They gave that win back in the nightcap, and you could put a lot of it on Pee Wee. In the 7th inning of a scoreless tie at Brooklyn, Freddie Fitzsimmons on the mound, Reese booted an easy grounder off the bat of the light-hitting Frank "Creepy" Crespi to open the inning. The next batter, fellow rookie shortstop Marty Marion, hit a ball in the hole, and Reese, trying to make the long throw to first, heaved it away. The Cardinals scored 3 runs in the inning, all accounted for as unearned. Camilli hit a solo shot in the bottom of the 8th, but that proved to be the Dodgers' last at-bat as the 9th inning was totally washed away by rain. Final score, Cardinals 3, Dodgers 1. After the game, DeRocher was furious, but perhaps because he was a fellow shortstop himself, he wasn't mad at Reese. "This was our chance to clamp down the crusher, and we blew it. Every time we've had a chance to put those guys in their place this season, we've blown it. I don't think they'd ever recover if we'd given them a double dose today." "But," the writers asked, "wasn't he going to bench Pee Wee?" "No. Errors are part of the game. Reese helped us win Sunday, didn't he? Why should I bench him now? I'm not squawking about that. What I'm squawking about is the way we look like old maid ants at the plate. Twice in the early innings, we filled the bases. 3 times the Cardinals conceded us a run by playing the infield back. A fly ball or even a grounder puts Fitz ahead. And what happens? Pop up and bring in nobody. You can't blame the kid for the fact that we didn't get runs." After the game, foreshadowing something that happened just this past week with Miami Marlins rookie Ronnie Simon, when he made 3 errors and was very nearly charged with a 4th, Reese sat at his locker weeping. As with Simon's Marlins teammates, Reese's Dodgers tried to cajole him. "Come on, how about a shower for all of us?" Fitzsimmons asked. Really, he did. Quoth the eagle, Pee Wee didn't move. The place was like a morgue. A morgue where the employees shower together, I guess, but only when they're sad. Leo was more constructive. He wasn't always during his career, but he was here. "Come on, Pee Wee. Do you think that's the last error you're going to make? Snap out of it. You'll be there tomorrow and the next day, and you'll be booting other balls, so save the tears." I'd like to think that it was after this game that Camilli took Reese back to the infield, stood at first base, and demonstrated his own range, saying something like, "Look, imagine a box around me that's 8 feet high and 12 feet wide. Don't worry about hitting me exactly. Just keep the throws inside that box and I'll corral it." And that helped calm Pee Wee Reese. He still made 9 errors in August, but that's less than 14. More importantly, while Reese, as I said, did lead the National League with 47 errors in 1941, that was both the first and last time that he would do something like that. And I know this isn't exactly connected, but I feel like it is. The Dodgers did hold on to beat the Cardinals and win the pennant, and went on to play the Yankees in the World Series. This was a big deal both in New York and nationally. Brooklyn was having a bit of a cultural moment then. It was like the whole country decided that the borough was populated entirely by lovable lugs, rough but warm-hearted eccentrics with funny accents. Game 3 was played on October 4th at Brooklyn. Fitzsimmons going for the Dodgers, he just keeps recurring in this story, against lefty Marius Russo for the Yankees. Russo was from Brooklyn, actually. He's not very well remembered today, but his story was like that of a lot of pitchers. He came up at 24, pitched very well for a few years, and then his arm went back on him. In his case, whatever recovery he might have been able to put together was set back additionally by the Second World War. Still, Yankees number 22 went 36-21 with a 3.01 ERA over those first 3 seasons, twice winning 14 games. He and Freddie exchanged zeros for 7 innings. In the top of the 7th, Russo came to bat with 2 outs and 1 on, and he lined the ball up the middle, unfortunately catching Fitzsimmons on the left knee, shattering the kneecap. That wasn't only the end of Fitzsimmons' World Series, it was more or less the end of his pitching career. There were a couple of abortive comebacks, but he just couldn't do it. And the reason that I bring this up is that Russo's liner hit Fitzsimmons so hard that it bounced up in the air, and Pee Wee Reese coolly caught it for the 3rd out of the inning. Maybe that's evidence that Jerry Nugent lied about Dolph Camilli. To say that Camilli was selfish just because he wanted to be paid what he was worth is what you would call a calumny, a lie designed to injure his reputation. Nugent, as I said earlier, was trying to salve his own tattered reputation by damaging someone else's, a dad of 7 no less, although MacPhail used to insist that it was 8 just to annoy him, and that kind of needling is one thing, but to say that to a generous man, a team man, is selfish itself in an altogether more pernicious way. And it wasn't true. Just ask Pee Wee Reese. Do you know there's been exactly one full-length biography of Pee Wee Reese? Well, one that's sort of for kids and then one that's for adults. That's the only one with the hot and heavy, unexpurgated Pee Wee action. But if you'd like to continue our interaction, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group, but I'm honestly efforting for this to be the last week. For now, though, should you head over there, you will see what a photo of Uncle Robbie's scar. Some of us have hobbies, what can I say? Should you wish to support the show, and surely some of you must, then please head over to patreon.com/theinfiniteinning, gear of a rudimentary kind, available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, try doing it on your dishwasher. Dishwashers can do all kinds of things they weren't able to do in the old days. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. It's called The Infinite Man, and certainly that is what we are all aspiring to be. As Dr. Rick reminds us, when we open the gates of infinity, we close the back stairs of narrow-mindedness. Well, if I can just go out the front door of the Bluebird of Happiness, because I've been crashing at his pad, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.